The morning sun crept over the quiet suburban neighborhood of San Antonio, Texas. A slight breeze rustled the trees, and the world outside carried on as usual. Cars backing out of driveways, joggers making their rounds, and sprinklers watering perfectly manicured lawns. It was the kind of morning that shouldn't have been remarkable in any way. But for a select few people, it was a morning filled with an unshakable sense of unease. At exactly 9:07 a.m., Joanna White pulled into the driveway of her best friend's house. She had done this dozens of times before, but today was different. There was something unsettling about the scene in front of her. Andreen McDonald's white luxury SUV was still parked in its usual spot, untouched from the night before. The curtains in the house remained drawn, and the air felt oddly still. Joanna reached for her phone and dialed Andreen's number again, straight to voicemail. That was the third time this morning. She exhaled sharply, gripping the steering wheel. Something wasn't right. Andreen was always up early, always responsive. She was a woman of routine, never the type to vanish without a word. For a brief moment, Joanna considered driving away, convincing herself she was overreacting. Maybe Andreen had just forgotten to charge her phone. Maybe she had gone out for a morning errand and would be back soon. But then she remembered the last time they spoke. Just the evening before. They had been texting late into the night, as they often did. Andreen had seemed a little tense, but she brushed it off when Joanna asked about it. "Everything's fine. Just some business stuff," she had replied. It wasn't the first time she had been vague about things. But now with her phone off, her car untouched and no sign of movement in the house, Joanna couldn't ignore the feeling gnawing at her. She got out of the car and knocked on the front door. No answer. She rang the doorbell. Nothing. The silence was suffocating. Joanna glanced around the property. The house itself was pristine, like always. Andreen was meticulous about keeping things in order. But there was one detail that stood out. A small window in the garage was slightly open, something that Andreen would never leave unattended. Her heart pounded. After a few more unsuccessful attempts to call and knock, she took a deep breath and reached for her phone again. This time she dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? "Hi, I'm calling about my friend. I think something might be wrong. She's not answering her phone, her car is still here, and her house is locked up. She never just disappears like this. Can you confirm her name and address?" "Andreen McDonald. She lives at—" Joanna gave the address, her hands trembling. "Has she mentioned anything recently that made you concerned for her safety?" Joanna hesitated. There had been signs. Andreen had been more reserved than usual lately, more careful with her words, but she had never outright said she was afraid. Still, Joanna knew better than to ignore her instincts. "She was acting a little off last night," she finally admitted, "but I don't know if that means anything." The dispatcher's voice was calm, procedural. "Officers are on their way." Joanna hung up and took a shaky breath. The waiting was unbearable. She paced back and forth, trying to suppress the worst-case scenarios forming in her mind. 15 minutes later, a police cruiser pulled up. Two uniformed officers stepped out, scanning the scene before approaching Joanna. "You reported a missing person?" one of them asked. "Yes," Joanna nodded quickly. "Her name is Andreen McDonald. She's my best friend. I haven't been able to reach her all morning, and her car is still here. It doesn't make sense. Something's wrong." The officers exchanged glances. "Has she gone missing before?" Number never. "Are there any signs of forced entry?" "No, but—" Joanna gestured toward the open garage window. "That wasn't like that before." One officer nodded and made a note. The other walked toward the front door and tried the handle. Locked. Then he circled around the house, inspecting the perimeter. Joanna stood there, arms crossed, her stomach twisting. What if they didn't take her concerns seriously? But then something changed. The second officer reappeared from the side of the house, his expression shifting. "There's a back door," he called out. "It's unlocked." Joanna felt a cold chill run down her spine. The officers exchanged a silent understanding before stepping inside. And that's when the first unsettling discovery was made. Inside the house, everything appeared too perfect. The furniture was neatly arranged, the floors spotless, the kitchen counters free of clutter. But something was off. On the dining table sat Andreine's purse, phone, and keys untouched. A half-empty glass of wine was still sitting on the kitchen counter, as if someone had walked away mid-sip and never returned. One officer pulled on gloves and picked up Andreine's phone. No recent activity. It had been powered off sometime during the night. Then, in the master bedroom, one of the officers hesitated. The faintest trace of a metallic scent lingered in the air. A careful step closer, and there it was. A small, dark stain on the floor, barely noticeable against the polished wood. They exchanged glances. A missing woman. A perfectly arranged house. A single stain, faint but undeniable. Something had happened here, and Andraine MacDonald was nowhere to be found. The air inside the house was eerily still. Officers moved carefully, their eyes scanning every inch of the space. It wasn't just quiet, it was too quiet. The kind of silence that carried weight, that hinted at an unfinished story. On the surface, nothing seemed obviously wrong. No overturned furniture, no broken glass, no immediate signs of a struggle. But the deeper they looked, the more unsettling the details became. In the kitchen, the half-empty wine glass sat on the counter, next to a closed laptop. No recent searches, no open tabs, just a black screen, as if someone had walked away mid-thought and never returned. On the dining table, Andraine's purse, phone, and car keys remained untouched. Her phone powered off, her car parked neatly outside. Then in the master bedroom, the first real clue. At first glance, it was immaculate. The bed was neatly made, the floor polished, but there near the edge of the bed was a faint reddish-brown stain. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it didn't belong. And just a few feet away, an empty bottle of heavy-duty cleaner sat beside a stack of used paper towels in the wastebasket. The officers didn't need years of experience to know that something wasn't right. By midday, the house was taped off as a potential crime scene. Crime scene technicians arrived, dusting for fingerprints, checking drains, and examining the floors under UV lights. Neighbors began to gather outside, whispering among themselves. A few reported seeing Andraine the day before, but none had seen her that morning. Others mentioned hearing arguing late at night, but had dismissed it as just another domestic dispute. One particular neighbor, an older man from across the street, recalled something that made the officers pause. "I was up late," he said, squinting in the sun. "Saw her husband outside. He was in the backyard near the fire pit. Thought it was strange, him being out that late." A fire pit. Investigators turned their attention to the backyard, where a modest fire pit sat in the corner, surrounded by bricks. At first, it looked like any other backyard feature, but as the officers stepped closer, they noticed something deep in the ashes, charred fragments of bone. The discovery changed the entire course of the investigation. As word spread, friends and family were contacted. None had spoken to Andraine that morning. Calls went unanswered. Texts were left on delivered, but never read. Then came a breakthrough. Joanna White, the woman who had first called 911, remembered something important. She had been texting Andraine late the night before. Their conversation had ended abruptly. There had been no warning, no explanation, just silence. She had assumed Andraine had gone to bed, but now with the investigation unfolding, that silence felt different. It felt like a sudden stop. Authorities dug deeper into Andraine's life. She was a successful businesswoman, the owner of a home healthcare company. Well-liked, respected. But behind closed doors, those closest to her knew she had been struggling with something personal. She had been more reserved lately, avoiding certain topics, dodging questions about her marriage. Some friends suspected trouble, but she never spoke openly about it. Then came another clue. Andraine had confided in a close friend weeks earlier, mentioning concerns about her relationship. She had started making changes, secret ones. She had begun moving certain assets into her own name. She had quietly looked at rental properties. And, most notably, she had removed her husband's name from their business documents. The timing was chilling. If she had truly been planning to leave, had something stopped her before she could? By late afternoon, the search for Andraine intensified. Officers canvassed the neighborhood, knocking on doors, looking for security footage. The backyard fire pit was now a focal point, with forensic specialists carefully collecting remains. At the same time, investigators started looking at one person more closely than anyone else, her husband, Andre MacDonald. As they dug into his history, certain patterns began to emerge. Andre was quiet, intelligent, and intensely private. He wasn't known for public outbursts or heated arguments, but those who knew the couple admitted there had been tension beneath the surface for some time. Friends described a shift in Andreen over the last few months. She had become more cautious, more careful. She no longer spoke about her husband the way she once did. There was no proof of wrongdoing, yet. But there was something else. Andre had not reported his wife missing. He had made no calls, no efforts to reach out to authorities. And when officers finally contacted him, his response was cold, detached. Andre MacDonald was located later that evening. He was calm, composed, almost indifferent. When asked about Andreen's whereabouts, his answer was simple. She probably went somewhere. No urgency, no concern, just a casual dismissal. When officers pressed for details, when did he last see her? Had they argued? His responses were vague. He claimed he had gone to bed, that he assumed she had left early in the morning. But there was one thing he couldn't explain. Investigators had already obtained security footage from nearby businesses, footage that showed Andre MacDonald at a Home Depot the day before, purchasing heavy-duty trash bags, gloves, and a shovel. The discovery sent chills down the officers' spines. Andreen MacDonald was missing. There were fragments of burned bone in the backyard. Her phone had been shut off, and now her husband had been seen buying materials that no ordinary person needed. Something had happened, and investigators were just getting started. As investigators pieced together the timeline of Andreen MacDonald's disappearance, the inconsistencies in her husband's statements became impossible to ignore. The timeline he provided was vague, almost intentionally so. He claimed he had last seen Andreen the previous night, but he couldn't remember exactly when. He suggested she had left early in the morning, yet her phone, purse, and car keys remained untouched inside the house. The backyard fire pit, now a primary focus of the investigation, yielded even more disturbing evidence. Forensic specialists carefully sifted through the ash, uncovering small, brittle bone fragments. Some were burned beyond recognition, others still bore the unmistakable porous structure of human remains. Among the debris, they also found melted metal, consistent with the remnants of jewelry. Andreen had been known to wear a delicate bracelet daily, one that had not been recovered among her belongings. Meanwhile, a search warrant was executed for the MacDonald home. In the garage, investigators found a heavy-duty axe, a claw hammer, and a large industrial-strength trash bag, items that had no reasonable place in an average suburban household. More troubling, a recent receipt from a local hardware store confirmed these were purchased just days before Andreen's disappearance. Detectives turned to surveillance footage. The time-stamped video from Home Depot showed Andre MacDonald walking into the store alone, purchasing a shovel, heavy-duty contractor bags, gloves, and a can of gasoline. The footage was irrefutable. The date and time aligned almost exactly with when Andreen was last seen alive. Authorities now had compelling circumstantial evidence. While no official declaration had been made, the investigation was quickly shifting from a missing persons case to something far more sinister. But there was still no body. A forensic team continued their examination of the MacDonald home, using luminol testing to detect blood that may have been cleaned from surfaces. In the master bedroom, a faint but undeniable presence of human blood was discovered near the stain previously noted on the floor. The bathroom drains also showed traces of biological material, though it had been heavily diluted, suggesting an attempt to erase evidence. Investigators knew they needed more. The presence of blood alone wasn't enough. It had to be linked to Andreen. Meanwhile, friends and colleagues of Andreen began sharing their accounts of the days leading up to her disappearance. They described her as distracted, uneasy, and uncharacteristically reserved. A friend recalled how, just a few days prior, Andreen had mentioned that if anything happened to her, people should start looking close to home. The words now carried a chilling weight. Detectives also spoke to employees of Andreen's healthcare business, who revealed that she had recently made significant financial moves, including transferring ownership of assets solely into her name. Some suspected this was in preparation for a separation, possibly even a divorce. If Andreen had been planning to leave, had her husband known? And if he had, how had he reacted? The case was tightening around Andre McDonald, but without a body or a confession, prosecutors knew securing a conviction would be a challenge. Surveillance data showed that Andre's cell phone had pinged at multiple locations outside the home in the hours following Andre's last known contact. The locations were spread across miles of wooded areas and open fields, potential places to dispose of evidence. Investigators prepared to search these locations, knowing that if they could find even the smallest trace of Andreen, the case against her husband would grow even stronger. By now, Andre McDonald had stopped cooperating. After initially answering a few basic questions, he had quickly lawyered up and refused further discussion. His silence spoke volumes. A search party was formed, made up of law enforcement and volunteers. They combed through the areas where Andre's phone had last been active, focusing on isolated patches of land and heavily wooded regions. With each hour that passed, the possibility of finding Andreen alive diminished. The investigation had now entered a critical stage. The evidence suggested something violent had occurred. The timeline, the forensic findings, and Andre's own behavior painted a picture that was growing clearer by the day. And yet, one question remained unanswered. Where was Andreen McDonald? The search for Andreen McDonald had reached a critical juncture. Investigators had forensic evidence, suspicious purchases, and a timeline that painted a grim picture. But without a body, the case was still incomplete. Authorities knew they needed something definitive, something that would remove all doubt about what had happened. With Andre McDonald refusing to cooperate and his legal team blocking any further questioning, the focus shifted to physical evidence. The charred bone fragments from the backyard fire pit were now under analysis. Forensic experts meticulously examined each piece, using advanced techniques to determine whether they could be identified. The process was painstaking, requiring comparisons to dental records and DNA samples from Andreen's personal belongings. At the same time, search teams expanded their efforts. The digital forensic unit had traced Andre McDonald's cell phone activity, identifying several locations where he had stopped in the hours after Andreen was last seen. These locations included remote patches of land on the outskirts of town, areas not known for regular traffic. Law enforcement mobilized ground teams, drones, and cadaver dogs, focusing on areas where the phone had last pinged. Search teams moved methodically, scanning wooded areas, drainage ditches, and secluded fields. They knew that if Andreen's remains had been disposed of, time and nature had already begun to erase the evidence. Days passed. The search was exhaustive, but no major discoveries were made, until one afternoon when a search team found something unusual. Deep in a wooded area, more than 10 miles from the McDonald home, officers uncovered a small pile of partially burned clothing. Among the items was a torn piece of fabric that appeared to be from a woman's athletic wear, the same type that Andreen was last seen wearing. The discovery sent forensic teams rushing to the site. Nearby, a black plastic garbage bag was partially buried beneath a layer of fallen leaves. When officers carefully opened it, they were met with a foul odor. Inside, they found more charred fabric, human hair, and a substance resembling bone fragments. The area was immediately secured as a secondary crime scene. Samples were collected and rushed to the forensic lab for testing. If the DNA matched Andreen's, it would be the most damning evidence yet. Meanwhile, the investigation into Andre McDonald's movements continued. Surveillance footage from a gas station near the search site provided yet another critical piece of evidence. Just hours after Andreen had gone missing, Andre's black SUV was captured, pulling into the station, filling up a red gas canister, and driving off toward the direction where the remains were later found. Authorities were now closing in. As forensic teams worked around the clock to confirm the identity of the remains, prosecutors prepared to move forward with charges. The circumstantial evidence was mounting, but they needed the scientific proof to ensure an airtight case. Then the breakthrough came. DNA analysis confirmed that the remains found in the woods belonged to Andreen McDonald. The confirmation triggered a shift in the case. What had once been treated as a missing persons investigation was now officially classified as a homicide. A warrant was issued for Andre McDonald's arrest. When law enforcement arrived at his home, he did not resist. His demeanor was eerily calm, as if he had been expecting this moment. He was taken into custody and booked on charges related to the unlawful disposal of a body and tampering with evidence. But investigators knew that was only the beginning. The ultimate charge, murder, was still looming. Now the focus would turn to proving the intent behind the crime and uncovering exactly what had happened on the night Andreen McDonald vanished. With the confirmation that the remains found in the woods belonged to Andreen McDonald, the investigation shifted into its most crucial phase. Now, it wasn't just about proving that she had been killed, it was about proving that Andre McDonald was responsible. Law enforcement had a mountain of circumstantial evidence. The surveillance footage showing Andre purchasing tools and supplies, commonly used in crime scene cleanup, the backyard fire pit containing human bone fragments, the inconsistencies in his statements, and now the discovery of Andreen's burned remains in a location that was directly linked to his phone records. However, in the eyes of the law, circumstantial evidence alone would not be enough. Prosecutors needed to establish a direct connection between Andre and the act of murder. They needed motive, intent, and forensic evidence that placed him at the scene of the crime when Andreen was killed. As forensic scientists continued their analysis, investigators turned their attention back to the McDonald home. If Andreen had been killed there had to be more evidence, something that had been overlooked, something that would confirm how she died. Crime scene specialists conducted a second round of luminol testing, this time focusing on the garage, the bathroom drains, and the flooring beneath the master bedroom carpet. Under specialized lighting, traces of blood became visible in multiple locations, places where someone had attempted to scrub the evidence away. The most telling discovery was in the garage. Even though the concrete floor had been cleaned, the chemical agents in luminol revealed patterns consistent with blood spatter, particularly near the area where Andre had stored the heavy-duty trash bags and cleaning supplies. This suggested that Andreen's body had been moved through the garage before being transported elsewhere. Authorities also retrieved data from Andreen's fitness tracker, which had been synced to her phone. The last recorded movement occurred late in the evening, around the time neighbors recalled hearing an argument at the McDonald home. After that, the device had been completely inactive. The timeline was now becoming clearer. Investigators believed that after a confrontation in the master bedroom, Andreen had been fatally injured. The attempt to clean up evidence indicated that Andre did not act in self-defense, but instead sought to cover up what had happened. The presence of Andreen's remains in a remote location also suggested premeditation, as the disposal required planning and travel. Meanwhile, prosecutors built their case meticulously. They conducted interviews with Andreen's family, friends, and employees, gathering statements about the state of her marriage, her plans to leave, and her fears in the days leading up to her death. They also subpoenaed bank records, discovering that Andreen had started moving money into a separate account, one that Andre no longer had access to. These financial changes were significant. They indicated that Andreen had been preparing for a separation, possibly even a divorce. If Andre had discovered her plans, it could have led to a confrontation that escalated into violence. But even with all this evidence, the biggest hurdle remained. There were no eyewitnesses, no direct video footage of the crime, and no confession. Andre McDonald continued to refuse to speak, exercising his right to remain silent. He was held in custody, awaiting trial, but his legal team argued that without conclusive forensic proof of how Andreen died, the state would struggle to prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. Prosecutors now had to determine the official charge. Would they pursue first-degree murder, which required proving premeditation? Or would they opt for a lesser charge such as second-degree murder or manslaughter, which carried a lower burden of proof but also a reduced sentence? The pressure was mounting, and the public was watching. The case of Andreen McDonald's disappearance and murder had drawn national attention. News outlets followed every development. Legal analysts debated the strength of the case, and the community demanded justice. But would the evidence be enough? As the legal battle loomed, prosecutors knew that they needed one final piece of irrefutable proof. And time was running out. As the case against Andre McDonald progressed, prosecutors faced the most challenging part of their job, proving beyond a reasonable doubt that he was responsible for Andre McDonald's death. The evidence was strong, but it was largely circumstantial. The legal team knew that while they had established motive, timeline, and forensic findings, they still lacked direct proof of how Andreen died. Without that, the defense could argue that there was no definitive cause of death, making a first-degree murder charge difficult to secure. Despite this challenge, the prosecution moved forward. The grand jury formally indicted Andre McDonald on charges of manslaughter and tampering with evidence. While the lesser charge of manslaughter reflected the difficulty in proving premeditation, it also carried a maximum sentence of 20 years, a significant punishment, but not the life sentence that Andre's family had hoped for. The courtroom was packed when the trial began. Media outlets covered every moment, with legal analysts debating whether the state's case was airtight or if the defense would be able to introduce reasonable doubt. The prosecution outlined their argument methodically, focusing on three critical points: the forensic evidence, the discovery of Andre's burned remains, the traces of blood found in the McDonald home, and the backyard fire pit containing bone fragments that matched her DNA. The timeline, the inconsistencies in Andre McDonald's statements, the surveillance footage showing his trip to the hardware store, and the cell phone data placing him at the location where Andre's remains were found. Motive: Andre's financial moves to separate herself from Andre, her plans to leave, and her comments to friends about feeling uneasy in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Forensic experts testified, explaining how luminol testing had detected blood patterns in the home, how the condition of Andre's remains suggested an attempt to destroy evidence, and how Andre's attempts to clean up the crime scene pointed to intentional concealment rather than an accident. The defense, however, countered with a carefully crafted strategy. They didn't argue that Andre wasn't dead. Instead, they focused on the gaps in the prosecution's case. They pointed out that no one had witnessed a murder. They emphasized that there was no confirmed cause of death. Andre's remains had been too badly burned to determine the exact circumstances. They argued that the prosecution was relying on speculation rather than undeniable proof. This argument resonated with some legal experts. In criminal trials, reasonable doubt is a powerful defense. Without direct evidence of how Andre had died, the defense suggested that the state had failed to prove murder beyond a reasonable doubt. But then, the prosecution revealed a crucial piece of evidence, one that had not been publicly disclosed before the trial. Andre's Apple Watch, which had been synced to her phone, had recorded her heart rate data on the night she disappeared. The data showed a sudden and rapid spike, followed by an abrupt drop to zero. The pattern was consistent with a violent struggle, followed by sudden cardiac arrest or death. This evidence was damning. It was the closest thing to a real-time recording of Andre's final moments. Forensic analysts testified that this data aligned almost perfectly with the time frame investigators had already built. The moment Andre's heart rate flatlined coincided with the same time her phone activity ceased and when neighbors heard arguing from the McDonald home. It was the final puzzle piece that solidified the prosecution's case. The jury deliberated for several hours, carefully reviewing the evidence, the inconsistencies in Andre's statements, and the forensic findings. When they returned, the verdict was read aloud in a tense courtroom. Andre McDonald was found guilty of manslaughter and evidence tampering. The judge handed down a 20-year sentence plus an additional 5 years for tampering with evidence. For Andre's family, the ruling was bittersweet. While justice had been served, the punishment did not fully match the weight of the crime. They had hoped for a murder conviction, but in the eyes of the law, the missing element of direct cause of death had prevented a more severe charge. Outside the courtroom, the case continued to spark discussions on the challenges of prosecuting cases without a definitive cause of death. Many legal analysts pointed out that had Andre's body never been found, the case might never have made it to trial. The story of Andre McDonald became more than just a criminal case. It became a warning, a reminder that justice, while pursued relentlessly, does not always feel complete. For the investigators who had worked tirelessly, the trial's conclusion brought a sense of closure. But for Andre's loved ones, the absence of their daughter, mother, and friend would never be replaced by any verdict. Andre McDonald was now behind bars, but the true cost of what had happened, the loss of a life, the destruction of a family, and the lingering scars left on those who loved Andre, would last far longer than any prison sentence. The trial was over. The sentence had been handed down. Andre McDonald had been convicted of manslaughter and evidence tampering, receiving a 20-year prison sentence, along with an additional 5 years for attempting to destroy evidence. For prosecutors, it was a victory, albeit a complicated one. They had secured a conviction, but the inability to prove first-degree murder had left a lingering question. Had justice truly been served? For Andrine MacDonald's family and loved ones, the answer was less clear. Her mother, who had traveled from Jamaica to attend the trial, sat silently in the courtroom when the verdict was read. Her expression was unreadable, a mixture of exhaustion, grief, and quiet frustration. She had lost her daughter in an act of senseless violence, and yet the punishment handed down to the man responsible felt inadequate. In the weeks following the verdict, media outlets dissected the case. Legal analysts debated the challenges of prosecuting homicides without definitive proof of cause of death. Some argued that the state had done the best it could with the evidence available. Others believed that if Andrine's body had been discovered earlier, before being burned, forensic analysis could have confirmed exactly how she was killed, possibly leading to a stronger charge. Despite the conviction, questions still lingered. Investigators had never recovered the full remains of Andrine MacDonald. The forensic team had pieced together partial bone fragments, but the majority of her body had been destroyed by fire. The absence of a full autopsy meant that certain key details, such as the exact nature of her injuries, would forever remain unknown. Some legal experts suggested that Andrine MacDonald had benefited from the destruction of evidence. Without a full body, the prosecution had been forced to argue circumstantial connections rather than provide definitive proof of premeditated intent. Yet despite the gaps, the case had set a legal precedent. It demonstrated that even in the absence of a complete body, forensic evidence and digital tracking could still build a compelling case. The use of cell phone records, GPS data, and fitness tracker information had been crucial in reconstructing Andrine's last movements. But while the legal system had delivered its ruling, the personal toll of the case was only beginning to unfold. Andrine's daughter, a young child who had been diagnosed with autism, was now left without a mother. She had been too young to understand the full tragedy, but as she grew older, she would inevitably ask questions. She would one day learn the truth, that her mother had been taken from her in the most violent and cruel way imaginable. Family members stepped in to provide care, ensuring that Andrine's daughter would be raised with love and stability. But nothing could replace the presence of her mother, and the emotional wounds left by her absence would never fully heal. Meanwhile, in the prison system, Andrine MacDonald adjusted to his new reality. The man who had once held a respected position as an Air Force major now lived among convicted felons, stripped of the authority and control he had once possessed. Reports from inside the correctional facility suggested that he had remained mostly silent, avoiding interaction with other inmates. Whether he felt guilt, remorse, or simply resignation to his fate was unclear. Despite his conviction, he had never formally admitted to killing Andrine. His silence was, in many ways, his final act of control. He had deprived Andrine of her life, and now he deprived her family of full closure. They would never hear him say the words that confirmed what they already knew. Outside of prison, Andrine's name became a symbol. Her case served as a reminder of the silent struggles many women face behind closed doors. She had been strong, independent, and successful, but she had also been caught in a marriage that, to those closest to her, had shown signs of trouble. In the months following the trial, advocates for domestic violence awareness invoked Andrine's story as a cautionary tale. Her case highlighted the dangerous reality of abusive relationships, particularly those in which the victim hesitated to speak out. The warning signs had been there: her withdrawn demeanor, her quiet financial moves, her private admissions to friends about feeling uneasy. For some, Andrine's case was a wake-up call. For others, it was a tragedy that could have been prevented. As time passed, the public's focus shifted. New headlines emerged, new stories demanded attention. But for Andrine's loved ones, the pain did not fade. The courtroom battle had ended, but the real sentence, the one her family would endure for a lifetime, had only just begun. The trial was over. The sentence had been delivered. But for Andrine MacDonald's loved ones, the pain remained. No conviction, no prison sentence, and no legal victory could bring her back. Her mother returned home to Jamaica, carrying the weight of a grief that would never fully heal. She had come to the United States hoping to find closure, but instead she left with the devastating reality that her daughter had died a brutal death at the hands of the man who had once vowed to protect her. Andrine's daughter, too young to understand the full extent of what had happened, was placed in the care of family members. She would grow up knowing her mother only through photographs, stories, and fleeting memories that time would slowly erode. One day she would learn the truth. She would ask why her mother wasn't there, why she had vanished from her life, and why her father had been sent to prison. And when those questions came, her family would have to relive the nightmare all over again. For the investigators who had worked tirelessly on the case, there was a bittersweet sense of resolution. They had followed the evidence, uncovered the truth, and ensured that Andre MacDonald was held accountable for his actions. But in many ways, their work felt incomplete. They had pieced together the fragments of a crime, yet there were still gaps that would never be filled. The exact moment Andreen lost her life, the final words she might have spoken, and whether she had fought back in those last, terrifying seconds. Inside prison walls, Andre MacDonald remained silent. He never confessed, never expressed remorse, and never provided the one thing that Andreen's family wanted most: the truth. Even in his incarceration, he maintained control in the only way he could, by withholding the full story of what had happened that night. His refusal to speak left a permanent wound on those who had fought for justice. There would always be questions that went unanswered, always a sense that Andreen's story had been left unfinished. But despite the unresolved details, her name would not be forgotten. Andreen's case became a rallying cry for domestic violence awareness. Advocacy groups cited her story in their fight for stronger legal protections for victims in toxic relationships. Her friends, once just ordinary people caught in a tragedy, now used her memory to warn others about the subtle signs of control, manipulation, and danger that often go unnoticed, until it's too late. The case also sparked conversations about how justice is defined. To some, Andre MacDonald's sentence did not feel like enough. They believed that the destruction of evidence, the deliberate attempts to cover up the crime, and the years of tension leading up to Andreen's death pointed to something far more calculated than manslaughter. But in the eyes of the law, without a clear cause of death, this was the best conviction possible. For legal experts, the case highlighted the gaps in homicide prosecutions, the difficulties of securing a murder conviction without a full body, a witness, or a clear-cut confession. It reinforced the importance of forensic technology, digital tracking, and behavioral analysis in solving crimes where the evidence was deliberately erased. Yet for all the legal discourse and national attention, at the heart of this case was a woman whose life had been taken too soon. A woman who had built a successful business, who had provided for her daughter, who had confided in friends about her fears but never had the chance to escape. Her name became more than a headline. It became a warning, a reminder, a lesson that no one should ignore their instincts, that danger can exist behind closed doors, and that silence can sometimes be the loudest cry for help. In the end, justice had been served by the limits of the legal system, but true justice would have been Andreen MacDonald walking away alive. She never got that chance, but her story would live on, not as a tragedy, but as a call to action, one that no one could afford to ignore. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories.